There are 10,000 ways to die in the 41st millennium, but only a handful of ways to live long enough to be remembered. Some are born into noble houses that cling to privilege until the end. Others are pressed into the endless ranks of the Astra Militarum, feeding the galaxy's wars with their blood. And a rare few, like me, are stolen from our childhoods, chosen by warriors whose gaze feels like judgment incarnate. To be selected is no honor, it is a death sentence masquerading as a promise. I did not know that when the Space Marines came. Their ship blotted out the sky of my hive city, a shadow so vast it smothered the smog and ash that had been my world since birth. My gang had scattered into tunnels, hiding like vermin, but I could not run fast enough. Their servitors found me, dragged me out with iron grips that left bruises I still carry in memory. The Astartes who oversaw the collection didn't even speak. His eyes, like chips of ceramite, scanned me and marked me with a rune. In that moment, my life ceased being my own. It said most chosen never survive what follows. Some die in the surgeries, their bodies rejecting the alien organs that turn boys into angels of death. Others lose their minds in training, broken by the relentless discipline of masters who see weakness as heresy. And even among the survivors, not all prove worthy of becoming full battle brothers. Scouts are the crucible, where you are tested, bled, and hardened into something the Imperium can use, or discarded when you fail. I am telling you this story not because I triumphed, though I did, but because the journey itself is what matters. The Imperium doesn't care for your comfort, your dreams, or your soul. It only cares that you can serve. And service for a scout means living in shadows and learning how to kill without hesitation. If you hunger for more tales from the grimdark corners of the galaxy, stand with me, subscribe, comment, share. The Emperor protects those who lend their strength to the fight. My journey began the moment I was taken to the fortress monastery. The transport ship that bore us aspirants away was silent save for the sound of sobbing. Some were hive scum like me, others were feral world brutes, still snarling as they strained against their restraints. One boy from a noble line tried to speak to me, to convince me this was a destiny he had chosen willingly. He didn't last the week. The fortress itself loomed over a mountain range that pierced the clouds. Its walls were black stone and adamantium, its gates warded by statues that towered like gods. We were herded through halls lined with banners older than any world I had ever known, their colors faded but their wake eternal. Chaplains intoned litanies that echoed through the vaulted chambers, voices like thunder that promised only pain, duty, and obedience. The first trial was the simplest, endurance. They gave us no food, no water, no rest. We marched until our legs bled, until blisters tore and bones felt ready to snap. Any who fell behind were not whipped or beaten, they were simply left behind. Servitors collected their bodies. Whether dead or merely broken, I never knew. Those who remained were lined up in the apothecarian. The smell of antiseptic clashed with the iron tang of blood. I watched as the first boy was strapped down and cut open. The apothecaries worked with clinical precision, inserting organs, reshaping tissue, grafting the beginnings of what would become a Space Marine's physiology. Some aspirants screamed until their throats ruptured. Others went into shock and never woke. When it was my turn, I felt the cold steel bite, and the weight of anesthesia drag me into blackness. In that void, I dreamed of the Emperor's face, not as the priest described him, a golden father, but as a burning sun that seared me down to ash. When I woke, I was different, stronger, hungrier, more afraid. They told us that we were only at the beginning, that to be reborn as Astartes was not a gift, but a war waged inside our own flesh. The implants would grow with us, twisting us into something more than human, but only if our spirits proved strong enough to match. We were given no time to recover. The day after surgery, we were forced to spar, our wounds still fresh, our bones barely set. We fought each other under the gaze of towering sergeants in power armor. I remember my first opponent, taller than me, stronger, feral world blood in his veins. He grinned as he broke my nose with the first strike. I remember the taste of blood, the ringing in my skull, the way I nearly collapsed, and I remember the surge of something else. Rage, yes, but also clarity. I saw the opening in his stance, drove my knee into his gut, and used his own momentum to slam him to the ground. The sergeant nodded once, almost imperceptibly. That moment of recognition meant more than victory. It meant survival. Each day after blurred into a cycle of agony and revelation. I learned to strip and reassemble a bolter blindfolded, to march in perfect formation even when my legs trembled, to kill the hesitation that had once made me human. They told us the Emperor did not need men, he needed weapons, and we were being forged into the sharpest edge imaginable. Still, at night, in the barracks carved from living rock, I would hear the whispers. Some aspirants prayed for death to end the torment. Others plotted escape, though none succeeded. And a few vanished without sound, their bunks emptied, their names never spoken again. It was in those nights that I began to understand. This was not training. It was war already. We were not just fighting the sergeants, or the drills, or each other. We were fighting ourselves. Every weakness, every doubt, every shred of humanity that clung to us had to die before we could hope to wear the armor of an Astartes. And I was willing to kill every part of myself, if that's what it took. The trials had only begun.
They say a man's flesh is the canvas upon which the Emperor paints his will. For us aspirants, that canvas was torn open, burned, broken, and remade again and again until there was almost nothing left of the children we had once been. I remember the apothecarian with the clarity of trauma, the smell of disinfectant so strong it burned the throat, the low hum of cogitators, the chant of litanies to steady the surgeon's hands. Each day another implant, each day another piece of us stripped away and replaced by something alien. The first was the secondary heart. The cut across my chest burned like fire even through the numbing agents, and when I woke, I could hear two distinct beats pounding in my ears. A redundant organ, they told us, so that when the enemy crushed one, we would still rise. It was not comforting. It was a reminder that the Imperium expected us to be crushed, broken, torn apart, and still keep fighting. Then came the osmodula, the seed that would change our bones. They said it would thicken them, fuse them, make us able to endure the recoil of bolters and the impact of war. What they did not say was how it would twist us as it grew, how it would ache with every step as the skeleton reshaped itself into something less than human, more than human. There was no healing time, no pity. We were forced back into drills even as our bodies screamed rebellion. We sparred with cracked ribs, marched with swelling joints, carried training weights that made us collapse under their burden. If we failed, we were discarded. I remember one boy, a noble-born aspirant with hands too soft for this life, collapsing mid-run. The sergeants did not even glance at him as he choked on his own blood. The servitors dragged him away. And yet there was beauty in the brutality. Competence was rewarded. Those who learned quickly, who adapted, who endured were granted nods of approval from our masters. To see a scout sergeant tilt his head in recognition was like feeling the sun for the first time. We began to know our weapons too, not just as tools, but as sacred extensions of ourselves. The combat knife, almost comically large in our young hands, was sharpened each night under the dim light of the barracks. The instructors taught us to slit throats silently, to drive the blade between ribs where even Xenos armor could not always protect. The bolter, heavy and deafening, was more than a gun. It was a prayer in steel, each round a hymn to destruction. We were not yet permitted to wield them freely, but even holding one filled me with awe and terror. The sniper rifle, though, that was the scout's true instrument. Long, patient, unforgiving. We learned to lie motionless for hours, to steady our breathing until we could squeeze a trigger without a single tremor. We were taught that a single shot could change the tide of a battle, and that we were to be the Emperor's unseen hand in such moments. But weapons were not the only lessons. We were also taught silence. Days passed when no one was allowed to speak. Meals were taken in complete quiet, our instructors walking the rows like prowling predators. Those who broke discipline with even a cough were punished with isolation cells, stone coffins where one could hear only the echo of their own heart. Some broke in those cells. I endured. Yet even endurance could not protect us from what came next. The black carapace loomed ahead, the final implant that would forever bind us to power armor. But before it were lesser organs, the Laramans organ to clot our wounds, the catalepsian node to strip away the need for sleep, the preomner to digest poison. Each change stole another piece of humanity.
The catalepsion was the worst for me. After it, sleep came only in fragments, a few minutes stolen here and there. I began to dream while awake, seeing shadows crawl in the edges of my vision, hearing whispers in the fortress halls. Perhaps they were real, echoes of the warp bleeding into our trials. Or perhaps they were only the fractures of a mind stretched too thin. Either way, I learned to live with them. To fear them was weakness. It was during this phase that I began to understand something vital. The sergeants were not merely testing our strength. They were searching for something else. A fire, a will, an unbreakable refusal to die. I saw it when one aspirant, a feral world boy with eyes like a predator, snapped his own arm during training but kept fighting with the other. The sergeant overseeing him did not stop the fight. He simply watched, then nodded once as the boy collapsed in a pool of his own blood. That boy survived. Others, uninjured but lacking that fire, did not. I asked myself every night, did I have that fire? The fortress monastery seemed to whisper the answer in every corner. The statues of heroes past, their stone faces eroded by centuries, looked down with judgment. The chaplain's sermons were less about faith and more about the annihilation of doubt. They thundered, "You are not boys, you are blades. If you bend, you break. If you break, you are discarded. Only those who endure shall be ensheathed in glory." I clung to those words. By the end of the second cycle, my body was no longer mine. My muscles were thicker, my bones denser, my eyes sharper. I could run for days without food, fight through exhaustion that would kill a man, and carry weights that seemed impossible. Yet I still looked in the mirror sometimes and saw the boy from the hive gang, the scars on my arms, the hunger in my face, the fear. That boy was dying, slowly but surely, and the thing replacing him was not human. The first time I held a weapon meant for killing, truly killing, I understood what it meant to belong to the Adeptus Astartes. Until then, training had been suffering for its own sake. Endurance, surgeries, endless drills. But a weapon, that was purpose given shape. The sergeants brought us to the armory, a cavern of iron racks and sacred machines tended by red-robed tech marines. Their mechadendrites whirred and clicked as they moved, blessing each weapon with rites that were as much machine code as prayer. Ozone and incense filled the air, a mixture that clung to the tongue like copper and ash. We were not given bolters, not yet. To touch such a holy instrument was a privilege reserved for proven initiates. Instead, they placed combat knives in our hands, thick, brutish things the length of a man's forearm, forged from plasteel so heavy it felt like lifting a shard of the fortress itself. "This is not a weapon," the sergeant growled. "It is an extension of your flesh. If you treat it as separate, you will die." We learned to stab, slash, parry. The drills never ended, repetition until muscle memory eclipsed thought. Then they blindfolded us and forced us to spar by sound alone, listening for the faint hiss of cloth or the whisper of breath. Those who failed left the ring bleeding. Those who succeeded were rewarded with nothing but another drill. After knives came the bolt pistol, stripped of live ammunition, but still carrying the weight of destiny. Even empty,
The recoil could dislocate an unready wrist. I remember my first shot, the roar in my ears, the acrid smoke, the way it seemed to rattle my very bones. The sergeant's voice cut through it. Control your breath. Control the machine. If you cannot master your own body, you cannot master his weapon. But the crown jewel of scout training was the sniper rifle. When it was placed in my hands, I felt the gravity of it. Long-barreled, weight perfectly balanced, its scope polished like the lens of a saint's eye. We were taken into the mountains, taught to crawl through gravel and frost without leaving trace, to lie still for days with stone digging into our ribs. Hunger gnawed, thirst burned, but we were forbidden to move. The test was simple: hit the target or die trying. My first attempt, I failed. The wind shifted, my bullet went wide, and the target remained untouched. The sergeant said nothing. Instead, he left me lying there, unmoving, until the cold of night turned my limbs into ice. By dawn, I was half dead with exposure, but when they placed the rifle in my hands again, I did not falter. I adjusted for the wind, slowed my heart, and fired. The target fell. The sergeant finally spoke. Adequate. Adequate. The highest praise we could hope for. Yet weapons were only half the lesson. Obedience was the other. The chaplains drilled into us that a scout was not a hero, but a shadow. We were to watch unseen, to strike only when commanded, to be as patient as death itself. They told us stories of those who failed, scouts who fired too soon, revealing their squad, dooming their brothers. Their names were curses on the lips of our instructors, reminders that hesitation or pride were heresies as damning as treason. It was during this phase that I began to notice the pattern of disappearances. Each week, fewer aspirants returned to the barracks. Some died in surgery. Others failed the weapons drills. But there were whispers of those who vanished in the fortress's lower halls. Some said they were executed for cowardice. Others said they had been fed to something lurking in the vaults, a beast kept by the chapter to weed out the unworthy. I did not ask questions. Questions marked you. Questions killed you. Still, the silence in the barracks grew heavier with each missing face. I began to sleep with my combat knife under my pillow, not against the sergeants, they would kill me before I could blink, but against the nightmares that seemed to creep closer each night. The nightmares grew worse after the osmodula fully rooted in my bones. I dreamed of my skeleton tearing itself free, walking without flesh, a hollow shell that laughed in a voice not my own. I would wake drenched in sweat, my secondary heart pounding, and wonder if it was the warp pressing against my mind. But dawn always came, and with it, more drills, more lessons in death. We practiced infiltration in the ruins of a mock hive built into the fortress grounds. Smoke grenades choked the air, simulated Vox signals echoed with false orders, and servitors armed with stun weapons patrolled like tireless enemies. We learned to move as one, gestures replacing words, silence our only ally. The first time my squad breached a room without a sound, taking down every servitor in precise succession, I felt something stir in me. Not pride, not joy, something colder, a sense of belonging, of being part of a machine greater than myself. And in that moment, I realized I was no longer fighting to survive, I was fighting to become. At the end of that cycle, our sergeant stood before us, bolter slung across his chest, eyes hard as stone. You have learned the tools of death. You have learned obedience. Now, you will learn fear. I did not yet understand what he meant, but soon I would.
When the sergeant said we would learn fear, I thought he meant combat drills against overwhelming odds, or perhaps survival tests in the mountains, where cold and hunger claimed aspirants by the dozen. I was wrong. Fear was not taught with hardship, it was taught with reverence, through the weapons of the Emperor. We were led into the deepest halls of the fortress monastery, where the armory became a sanctum. Tech marines and robed servitors chanted binaric hymns, while censers released coils of sacred incense. Even before I saw the weapon racks, I could feel the weight of what waited there. It pressed against my chest like a hand, heavy and undeniable. Then the bolter was placed in my hands. It dwarfed me. Its weight pulled my arms low, every inch of it a reminder that I was still unworthy. The casing was engraved with purity seals, prayers stamped in wax by the chaplains themselves. My fingers trembled as I touched the trigger. I had seen guardsmen with las guns before, weapons that hissed and spat beams of light. But this was not a gun. This was a thunderclap, a piece of the Emperor's own wrath forged into ceramic and steel. The first shot shattered the silence. My shoulder nearly broke under the recoil, the roar of the round echoing like judgment itself. The target downrange did not just fall, it ceased to exist, torn apart in a storm of explosive fury. The sergeant barked, "Control it, you are not children, you are his chosen, his wrath must be wielded with precision, not waste." So we learned to brace our stances, to channel the strength our new organs provided. We learned to time our breathing, to fire in bursts rather than uncontrolled salvos. Each lesson ended with bruises, with strained muscles, with shoulders dislocated and set again. The bolter punished weakness, and only those who adapted swiftly could hope to keep firing. At night, my bones ached from the Osmadula's relentless work, but my mind replayed the bolter's roar. It haunted me, and it thrilled me. To fire it was to brush against divinity. To control it was to step closer to becoming more than human. But the bolter was not all. We were given the bolt pistol as well. Shorter, less cumbersome, but no less ferocious. Its recoil snapped against the wrist, a violent reminder that even a sidearm was a weapon of war beyond mortal ken. In drills, we learned to draw it in a heartbeat, to fire while moving, to put rounds through targets as we slid into cover. The sergeants called it the lifeline of a scout, a tool for when silence failed, when the knife could not finish the kill, when patience gave way to chaos. Then came the heavy bolter demonstrations. We were not permitted to wield them yet, but we watched as full Space Marines hefted them with effortless strength, unleashing storms of death that reduced armored targets to slag. The ground shook with each burst, the air filled with the acrid scent of propellant. That was the moment I understood the scale of what we were training to join. Even as scouts, even as half-formed warriors, we were being molded to serve alongside gods. And yet, even gods bled. The sergeants never let us forget that. The bolter will fail if you fail. It is only as strong as the hand that carries it. Do not trust in the machine more than you trust in your brothers. That was when we were taught maintenance rights. We stripped the weapons down, learning to name each piece not in technical schematics, but in the litanies of our chapter. The bolt was the heart. the casing, the skin, the trigger, the voice. We learned to clean each component with reverence, whispering prayers as we reassembled them. Failure to respect the weapon was treated as blasphemy. The chaplains came often during these lessons, reminding us that the weapon was not ours, it was the Emperor's, and we were but vessels of his will. To misuse it was heresy. To master it was salvation. Despite the brutality of training, there were moments of awe. I recall lying prone with my sniper rifle, watching the horizon through its scope. The mountains glowed in the fading light, shadows stretching like claws across the valley. For hours I tracked a moving target servitor, waiting for the perfect shot. My stomach cramped with hunger, my lips cracked with thirst, but I held steady. When the shot came, it was not just a kill, it was silence made absolute. The sergeant's words echoed in my skull. A scout's rifle is patience given form. Learn patience, and you will outlive the galaxy itself. And so I began to change. The fear was not of the weapons anymore. It was of failing them, of failing him. A bolter's roar became my heartbeat, the sniper's silence my breath, the knife's weight my will. But training was never allowed to be comfortable. On the 10th cycle, they woke us in the dead of night, dragging us from our bunks and marching us into the darkened halls. No explanation, no instructions, just the echo of boots on stone. That was when the whispers started. Rumors of the fortress' shadowed wings, of aspirants taken there and never returning, of trials that had nothing to do with drills or weapons. That was when we learned the cost of weakness went far beyond pain. And that fear, the fear of what lurked in the fortress' dark halls, stayed with me longer than the bolter's roar.
The fortress monastery was vast, older than memory, its stone carved by hands long dead. For all its grandeur, it was also a tomb, a labyrinth of shadows and sealed chambers where silence ruled. The sergeants had shown us the training grounds, the barracks, the apothecarian, but there were places they did not speak of, places where whispers clung like mold. We learned to fear those places when the first of us vanished. His name was Varric, a feral worlder who had broken more jaws in sparring than I could count. He was strong, unyielding, the kind of aspirant who seemed carved from iron. One night, he was there in the barracks, sharpening his combat knife by the dim glow of a lumen stripe. By dawn, his bunk was empty. No alarms, no shouts, no sound at all. His gear was gone. His name was scratched from the slate of trainees. When we asked the sergeants what had happened, their only answer was silence. That silence spread. Others disappeared, one by one, always at night. Sometimes a muffled noise stirred us awake, the faint scrape of boots dragging across stone, or a gasp swallowed too quickly. By the next morning, another bunk would be vacant. We were told nothing, but the chaplain's sermons grew darker. They spoke of weakness as rot, of doubt as a poison that must be purged. The Emperor does not tolerate imperfection, one thundered. Those who falter are cast into the pit where they belong. None of us dared to ask what pit he meant. It was during this time that I began to hear the fortress itself. At night, lying rigid on my cot, I swore I could hear breathing in the walls. Sometimes footsteps echoed where no one walked,
Once I heard the rasp of something dragging across stone, slow, deliberate, patient. The others heard it too. We never spoke of it in words, only in the way we glanced toward the vaulted doors, or the way we clutched our knives beneath the sheets. Then came the night they tested us. The sergeants woke us without a word, ordering us into formation. No armor, no weapons beyond our knives. We were led into the unlit corridors beneath the fortress, where torches sputtered and the air was heavy with damp stone. I remember the smell, rust, mold, and something sweet and rotten, like blood left too long in the heat. They did not tell us the rules of this trial. They only sealed the doors behind us. For hours we wandered in silence, the only light the glow from our dim torches. The walls were carved with murals of past battles, their heroes' faces half eroded by time, their enemies depicted as shadows with claws and fangs. My heart beat like a drum, echoing in my chest with its twin rhythm. We were not alone. The first scream came from somewhere ahead. By the time we reached it, only blood marked the floor, a slick trail leading into darkness. Another aspirant was gone. We tightened our formation, but fear gnawed at every step. Something stalked us. We caught glimpses, movement in the corners, a flash of pale flesh, the gleam of eyes that reflected torchlight. We lashed out, striking at shadows, hitting only stone. The air grew thicker, the torches dimmer, as though the fortress itself were suffocating us. And then we found them. The failures. Dozens of cells lined the corridor, their bars rusted but unbroken. Inside were the aspirants who had vanished. Emaciated, broken, their eyes wide with madness. They whispered prayers in cracked voices, some clawing at the bars with bloodied fingers. Others sat motionless, their gazes fixed on nothing. One of them, Varric, still clutched his knife, though his hand was too weak to lift it. The sergeant's voice thundered from hidden vox speakers above us. This is the cost of failure. This is what waits for those who lack the strength to serve. Learn or join them. The cells sealed with a hiss, cutting off their wails. We were ordered onward. We marched, but something followed us still. I felt its breath on my neck more than once, the hot gust of air that smelled of iron and decay. I spun, knife ready, but saw nothing. Each time, another aspirant vanished in the dark. By the end, half of us remained. The sergeants were waiting in the torchlit hall above us, their faces unreadable. They said nothing of what had stalked us, nothing of the failures we had seen. They only ordered us back to the barracks. That night, as I lay awake, I realized what the fortress truly was. Not just a place of training, but a predator's lair. The chapter itself was the beast, devouring the weak, remaking the strong, and leaving bones in the dark. And if I wanted to survive, I had to become hungrier than the predator.
They called it the hunt. By then, the gene seed had twisted us further, heightening our senses to something beyond human. My nose could pick out the tang of sweat, the musk of fear, the metallic scent of blood. My eyes, once dull brown, could pierce shadow as though the night were only dimly lit day. I could hear a heartbeat across a clearing, the rasp of breath behind a tree. The sergeants told us this was no gift. It was a weapon, and weapons that dulled were discarded.
We were cast into the wilds of the chapter's world, a jagged wasteland of ash dunes, broken forests, and rivers the color of rust. Our task was simple: hunt, kill, and endure. Failure meant starvation, dismemberment by the beasts that prowled these lands, or worse, dishonored before our brothers. At first, the prey was animal. Hulking grox herds with hides thick as armor, razor-beaked avians that screamed through the sky, wolf packs that stalked even us in silence. My knife and rifle became extensions of myself. Every kill was a sermon in patience, every heartbeat slowed to the rhythm of the trigger. But the beasts were only the beginning. On the third night, the sergeants changed the rules. We woke to find one of our number gone, his bedroll empty. His blood marked the ground in a trail that led into the rocks. We followed, thinking another predator had dragged him off, but then we found his knife, buried in the chest of another aspirant. The sergeants had ordered it. We realized then we were the prey too. Trust evaporated like morning frost. We moved in packs, backs to one another, rifles trained on every shadow. Paranoia stalked us more fiercely than hunger. Every whispered step in the undergrowth became a threat, every shifting silhouette a possible killer. And then it happened to me. I was tracking a grox through the trees when I felt the hair on my neck rise, a soundless breath behind me. I spun, blade flashing, just in time to parry the downward strike of another aspirant's knife. His face was a mask of desperation, eyes wide, lips curled back in a snarl. We struggled, teeth bared like feral animals. His knife cut my cheek, hot blood dripping into my mouth. I drove my knee into his gut, twisted his wrist, and forced the blade against his throat. For a heartbeat, I hesitated. He was my brother in training, someone who had shared rations with me only days before. Then I remembered the cells beneath the fortress, the whispers of the failures. I pushed. His breath left him in a wet rattle, and the forest swallowed the sound. That night, the sergeants congratulated me without words. They only noted my kill on the slate. Each day blurred into another hunt. Animals, trainees, sometimes both. We grew leaner, sharper, our eyes hollow, our hands steady. We learned to move without sound, to strike without hesitation, to consume raw meat when hunger gnawed too fiercely. But the worst came on the final night. The sergeants loosed something into the wild with us. We never saw it fully, only the devastation it left behind. Trees splintered as if torn apart by claws the size of swords. Trails of ichor burned where they touched the ground. We heard its screams, shrill, alien, filled with hunger. One by one the aspirants fell to it, snatched screaming into the dark, or left as shredded husks dangling from branches. My enhanced senses betrayed me, for I could hear their deaths in horrifying detail. The snapping of bone, the tearing of sinew, the bubbling last breaths. I survived by becoming like the predator. I masked my scent with ash and blood. I lay motionless for hours, buried beneath the carcass of a grox, its stink cloaking me. I watched the shadow of the beast pass, its limbs too many, its shape unnatural, its eyes glowing like coals. When the sun rose, only a handful of us remained. The sergeants gathered us in silence, their faces impassive, as though they had not just unleashed horror into our veins. They did not praise us, they did not scold us. They only told us that the weak had been culled, and that we, the survivors, were closer to becoming true weapons of the Emperor. I looked at my hands that day, caked in dried blood, trembling with exhaustion. They were no longer the hands of a boy. They were the talons of something else, something that hunted in darkness.
and I understood, with sick clarity, what the chaplains meant when they said, "A space marine is not born. He is carved, sharpened, and fed, until only the blade remains."
Fear was meant to be our teacher. The chaplains ensured it was also our constant companion. They gathered us in the reclusium, the vast chamber where the air always smelled of incense and old blood. The walls were lined with relics, chainswords broken in righteous battle, helmets still scarred with plasma burns, and the bones of heroes mounted like grim trophies. Skulls, dozens of them, stared down at us, their empty sockets daring us to falter. The chaplain stood before us, his armor blacker than night, his Crozius Arcanum resting across his chest like a judge's gavel. His skull helm reflected the torchlight, and when he spoke, his voice was thunder carried by vox amplifiers, every syllable a hammer blow against our thoughts. "Fear," he intoned, "is the chain that binds mortals to weakness. You will not be mortal. Fear must be your blade, not your chain." We knelt, trembling, not from exhaustion or pain, but from the weight of his presence. The chaplains were not like the sergeants. They did not shout or strike. They broke you from the inside. For hours they spoke of the Emperor's wrath, of demons lurking in the warp, of brothers who failed in faith and were torn apart by their own doubt. They described in excruciating detail the fate of those who turned away from duty. Not death, but corruption. Their words painted visions of flesh warping into tentacles, of screams that never ended, of damnation without release. And then came the tests. We were led into the Chamber of Echoes, a sealed vault with no light, no sound except our own heartbeats. They left us there for what felt like days, though my mind can't measure how long. In the darkness, fear grew teeth. My thoughts turned against me. Every breath seemed to whisper failure. Every beat of my heart pounded with the memory of the brother I had killed in the hunt. I heard voices, my mother's, telling me I had been stolen, that I was still only a child. My own voice accusing me of murder. Voices I had never known, speaking promises of power, of release from pain. But above them all, I clung to the chaplain's words. Fear is a blade. You hold it, or it cuts you. When they finally opened the door, only half of us crawled back into the light. The others, they remained in the darkness, their minds shattered. Their names were struck from the rolls, their bodies never seen again. After that came fire. Quite literally, we were stripped of armor, given nothing but knives, and cast into a burning labyrinth. The walls were stone, but the ceilings dripped with burning pitch, and flames licked at every corner. Smoke filled our lungs, choking us until we coughed blood. Somewhere within, the chaplain's voices echoed, carried through vox casters, reminding us the Emperor's light is purifying fire. If you fear flame, you cannot bear his truth. We ran, we crawled, we bled as the heat seared our skin. Those who faltered were consumed. One aspirant tried to turn back, only to be shoved forward by a chaplain's gauntlet, into the flames. His screams burned deeper than the fire itself. By the time we staggered out, we were blistered, coughing, half mad. And yet the chaplains greeted us not with kindness, but with a question. What did you fear? The correct answer, we learned, was nothing. To admit otherwise was to be beaten, flogged, and cast into another trial until your mind broke or your spirit hardened. But in truth,
We all feared. We feared the warp. We feared the silence of the chamber. We feared failing, for failure meant not just death, but erasure, becoming one of the nameless lost, devoured by shadows and forgotten by history. And still, fear was not the end. Fear was the beginning. It sharpened us, just as hunger had in the hunt. Fear drove us to wake with every nerve alive, every muscle tense, every sense sharpened beyond mortal limits. Fear carved away hesitation, doubt, and mercy. In its place grew something colder, harder, far more enduring. I did not yet understand it then, but the chaplains were shaping us into more than warriors. They were teaching us how to look into the abyss of madness and step forward unblinking, how to face horrors that would shatter mortal minds, and keep walking. Because what waited beyond training was not beasts, nor rival aspirants, nor even the labyrinth of fire. What waited was war.
The warp is not taught through words. It is endured. When the chaplains spoke of it, their voices lowered to a near growl, as though naming it too loudly might invite its attention. They called it a sea of madness, a storm of souls, a mirror that showed only corruption. But no sermon, no parable, no warning could truly prepare us for the trial. They marched us beneath the fortress monastery, through iron gates carved with prayers older than the chapter itself. The air grew colder as we descended, lanterns flickering against walls etched with sigils of warding. Every step downwards felt like walking into a tomb. At last, we reached a chamber, circular and vast, its ceiling lost in shadow. In the center was a black pool that reflected no light. The librarian awaited us there, his psychic hood shrouding his features, his staff crowned with a crystal that pulsed faintly like a beating heart. His voice slid into our minds without moving his lips, and even that small taste of psychic power made me want to retch. "You will walk the veil," he said. "The warp does not lie, it reveals. If you are weak, it will devour you. If you are strong, you will return sharper than before." One by one we stepped forward. When my turn came, I felt the librarian's hand on my skull, heavy as iron. The black pool seemed to rise, swallowing me, though my body never left the stone floor. And then, I was not in my body anymore. The warp was not a place, but an unraveling of places, a shifting storm of color and sound where nothing remained constant. Faces formed from smoke, screaming in languages older than stars. Planets flickered into existence only to burst into flame. A sky of blood rained down oceans of fire. Every heartbeat stretched into eternity. Every thought echoed into countless whispers. I saw myself reflected in countless forms. A child begging to go home. A warrior crowned in glory. A traitor kneeling to something vast and horned. Each version of me reached out, their hands melting into claws, their smiles splitting into fangs. The voices grew louder. Some promised freedom from pain. Some promised immortality. Some whispered that the emperor was a lie, that his throne was a prison of bone and ash. They clawed at my mind, offering everything, demanding only my surrender. And then the worst vision came. I saw my brothers from the hunt, those who had fallen, those who had been lost to the flames, those erased in the chamber of echoes. They cried out, blaming me for their deaths, their eyes hollow pits.
One reached into my chest, fingers curling around my beating heart. In that moment, I almost broke. The terror was total, but the chaplain's words struck me like a bolt of lightning from memory. Fear is the blade. You hold it, or it cuts you. I seized the hand within my chest, not with flesh, but with will. I wrenched it free and roared my defiance into the storm. And then a light, blinding, searing, golden. The Emperor's symbol blazed across the abyss. The whispers recoiled, shrieking, their promises dissolving into lies. The storm shattered around me. When I gasped awake, I was back in the chamber, sprawled on the cold stone, my throat raw as though I had been screaming. The librarian loomed above me, his expression unreadable. "You return," he said simply. Not all did. Around me, some aspirants lay twitching, their eyes burned white, their minds shattered. Others convulsed, their skin crawling with mutations before bolter fire from the sergeants ended them mercifully. The stench of blood and scorched flesh filled the chamber. Of the dozens who had entered, less than half crawled back into the world of men. We never spoke of what we saw, not because we feared the chaplains, but because the visions clung to us. To describe them aloud would be to admit they were real. But I carried mine in silence, the clawed reflection of myself, the traitor I might have been. It haunted me. It whispered still in the corners of my mind, not with the warp's voices, but in my own doubt. And I knew then, training was not only about flesh and strength, it was about spirit. The body could be made unbreakable, but the soul, that was where the true battle would always be fought.
The warp had marked us, but it was not the end of our trials. It was only the prelude. The first time I left the fortress monastery as a scout, I felt the weight of my transformation in every step. My body was no longer human, yet not fully Astartes. The implants burned beneath my skin, the osmodula lengthening bone, the hemastamen thickening my blood, the Laraman's orban knitting every cut almost as fast as it was made. I was stronger, faster, harder than I had ever dreamed as a boy. But none of that mattered. The battlefield would prove the truth of what we were becoming. Our deployment was sudden, no ceremony, no warning. Vox horns sounded at dawn, and we were loaded into a Thunderhawk, its engines screaming like chained daemons. Beside me sat other scouts, their faces pale, eyes fixed on the deck. We all wore carapace armor. No power armor yet. We had not earned that. Our weapons were plain, sniper rifles, combat knives, bolt guns stripped of ornamentation. Tools, nothing more. The sergeant stood at the front, clad in full ceramite, a true Astartes, towering above us, his every movement precise and deliberate. His voice rasped through the Vox helms. "This is not a drill. This is your baptism. You will kill for the Emperor, or you will die forgotten." The Thunderhawk's hull shook as it entered atmosphere. Fire licked across the viewports. Through the haze, I caught glimpses of the surface below. An ash-choked wasteland, once a mining world, now overrun by Xenos. Orks, their crude machines belched smoke across the horizon, their camps sprawling like tumors on the land. Fear gnawed at me, but I forced it down. I remembered the hunt, the chamber, the warp. If I had survived those, I would not falter here. The ramp slammed open and we poured into chaos. The sound was overwhelming. Bolters thundered, laser guns cracked, orcs roared with guttural fury. The air reeked of promethium and blood. The sergeant moved with calm precision, every bolt round a death sentence. He did not look back at us. He did not need to. We spread into position, as trained, rifles snapping to shoulders. My target appeared, a hulking orc knob, tusks yellow with filth, its crude armor splattered with human gore. My hands steadied, the world narrowing to the crosshairs. My finger squeezed, the round cracked, the round punching through its eye, spraying green itcher. The beast toppled with a roar cut short. It was my first true kill. There was no glory in it, only necessity. The orcs kept coming, their war cries rolled like thunder, their bodies a tide of muscle and rage. They crashed against our line, and suddenly it was knives and pistols, close enough to smell their rancid breath. One barreled into me, knocking me from my feet. Its crude axe came down in an arc meant to cleave me in two. Training took over. I rolled, drove my knife into its thigh, then fired my pistol point blank into its jaw. Its skull burst, showering me with gore. The weight of its body nearly crushed me, but I clawed free, lungs burning with adrenaline. Around me, brothers fell. Not all of us were ready. I saw one aspirant torn apart by sheer brute force, another dragged screaming into the orc horde. There was no pause, no chance to mourn. The sergeant's voice cut through the din. "Advance!" We did, step by brutal step, firing, stabbing, killing. Scouts moved like shadows, striking from flanks, using every ounce of training to survive. The enemy was larger, louder, more numerous, but we had precision. We had purpose. By nightfall, the orcs broke. Their crude morale shattered under the relentless fire of the Astartes and the sharp knives of their pupils. The survivors fled into the wastes, bellowing curses. We stood in the ruins, smoke choking the sky, the ground littered with corpses. My armor was cracked, my skin burned, my hands trembling from exhaustion. Yet I still breathed. The sergeant strode among us, his eyes cold behind his helm. He looked at each survivor, measuring us, not with pride but with calculation. We were not yet brothers. We were still tools being sharpened. But for the first time, I felt the faintest flicker of belonging. The battlefield had accepted me. And I knew I was no longer merely an aspirant. I was a scout of the Emperor's angels.
The orcs were not broken. They never truly were. Weeks after our first baptism of fire, we marched into the ash wastes. The chapter demanded a cleansing sweep. Destroy the scattered remnants of the Xenos warbands. Deny them ground to regroup. On paper, it was simple. In truth, it was another lesson. That victory in the Grimdark galaxy was never clean, never absolute. The ash wastes stretched endless and dead beneath a burning sky. Black dunes shifted like waves, whispering with every step. Ancient mining machines lay half-buried, their rusted frames jutting like the bones of titans. The air stank of sulfur and oil, and fine ash coated our tongues until even water tasted of grit. We moved in silence, a squad of scouts under the watchful eye of our sergeant. Our rifles were ready, Auspex units sweeping, every sense stretched taut. My implants made me aware of everything.
the faint scuttling of vermin beneath the sand, the distant growl of engines on the horizon, the rasp of breath in the brother beside me. It was too quiet. The sergeant raised his fist, halting us. His helm turned, scamming the ridge lines. I felt it then too, a weight in the air, that prickling instinct honed in the hunt. We were not alone. The ambush came in a storm of crude rockets. Trails of smoke carved through the sky as explosions ripped the ground apart. Ash and fire consumed us. I hit the dirt, ears ringing, armor rattling with shards of shrapnel. Through the haze, shadows rose, orcs, scores of them, pouring from trenches and hidden pits. Their war cries shook the wastes. The sergeant's voice cut through the roar. "Form! Hold the line!" We obeyed, bolters barking, sniper rounds punching through skulls. Orcs fell, but more surged forward. They swarmed like a tide, their blades gleaming with crude brutality. Every movement was chaos, dust clouds, muzzle flashes, the stink of blood. One charged me, axe raised. I fired, the bolt punching through its chest, but momentum carried it forward. Its corpse slammed into me, knocking me down. Another was already leaping, teeth bared. I rolled, drew my knife, and drove it upward into its throat. Hot ichor sprayed across my face. We fought like cornered predators, every kill another heartbeat stolen. Brothers screamed and fell, their blood joining the ash. The orcs pressed closer, their crude guns spitting death. The wastes became a killing ground. And then, hope. The sergeant surged into their ranks, chain sword roaring, every strike a masterpiece of efficiency. He moved like a storm given flesh, severing limbs, splitting torsos, never slowing. His presence was gravity itself, anchoring us against the tide. We rallied around him. Snipers dropped leaders, laze bursts tore through mobs, blades met flesh in brutal silence. The ambush became a slaughterhouse. Yet, even in victory, the lesson was clear. We were prey as much as hunters. The orcs knew our route, knew our numbers. They had planned. And though we survived, we had paid a cost. 2 brothers lay dead in the ash, their armor cracked, their eyes staring sightless into the wastes. Another was carried back broken, his arms severed, his body pierced by shrapnel. As we collected the fallen, the sergeant spoke at last. His voice was low, almost reverent. "This is the truth of war. The enemy will always be waiting. You are never safe. You are never done." His words carved into me deeper than any blade. Training had been trials, controlled horrors, staged nightmares. But this was reality. The galaxy itself was an ambush, a place where death could fall upon you in silence, in fire, in shadow. That night, as we set a watch beneath the corpse lights of burning orc wreckage, I sharpened my blade by the fire. My hands no longer trembled. Fear was there, yes, but it was an old companion now. I understood then what it meant to be a scout.
We were not yet space marines. We were not yet angels of death. We were shadows before the storm, the eyes and knives of the chapter. And in the wastes, in the silence after battle, I realized we were already half-dead men walking, learning to kill before we ever learned to live.
There is a silence that follows the death of a brother. It is heavier than the roar of bolters, more suffocating than the stench of blood. It is the weight of knowing that the void has claimed one of your own, and that tomorrow it might claim you. We carried the fallen from the ambush back to the fortress monastery. Their bodies were wrapped in shrouds of ash-stained cloth, their names spoken only once before they were consigned to the fires. There were no tears. We had been taught long ago that grief was weakness, but still the silence lingered. It was during those nights that I began to understand the true cost of this path. We were not simply losing numbers to battle. We were losing faces, voices, lives that had shared the same trials, the same pain. Each death was a reminder that our bond was as fragile as it was absolute. One brother struck me hardest, Kalen. He had been with me since the very first trial, the boy who had stolen meager scraps of food to share when hunger clawed our bellies. We had hunted side by side in the wastes, covering each other's flanks, whispering vows of survival. He had been fast, sharp-eyed, always quick to laugh, even when laughter felt like treason. He fell to an orc cleaver during the ambush. I had seen it. One moment he was at my side, firing into the horde. The next his body was split open, blood spraying the ash. I had no time to reach him, no time to do anything but survive. But survival carried its own wound. That night I sat in silence while the others sharpened their blades, while the sergeant made his quiet rounds. My hands were steady, but my thoughts churned. I had survived while Kalen had not. Was it luck? Was it strength? Or was it something darker? That the galaxy had simply decided his thread had ended, and mine had not yet been cut. The chaplain came to us the next day. He spoke of duty, of the Emperor's will, of how every brother's death was part of a greater plan. His words were iron, his tone unyielding. Your grief is a chain. Break it, forge it into vengeance. But vengeance felt hollow. What vengeance could bring Kalen back? What vengeance could fill the empty space where his voice should have been? The sergeant gave me no words, no comfort. Instead, he placed Kalen's knife in my hand. The blade was plain, its edge dulled by battle, but it was his. Carry it, the sergeant said. When you fight, he fights. That is how we remember. I carried that knife from then on, not as a relic, but as a part of me. Every time I drew it, I felt the echo of Kalen's laughter, the whisper of his vow. It made my strikes sharper, my patience longer, my resolve harder. Death taught me something the chaplains could not. It was not enough to fear nothing. It was not enough to wield fear as a blade. We also had to wield memory. Without it, we were machines. With it, we were something worse. Men who knew exactly what they had lost, and yet still chose to fight. That was the first time I truly understood what it meant to be a brother in the chapter. Not that we lived together, but that we carried the dead with us, each loss another stone in the mountain we bore upon our shoulders. The silence of Kalen's absence never left me. It became part of the rhythm of my heart, as constant as the thrum of blood in my veins. And though I would never speak his name aloud again, I swore an oath that night beneath the ash-choked stars. So long as I lived,
So long as my blade struck true, a part of him would remain. For in the grim darkness of the far future, remembrance is the only defiance we have against the endless tide of death.
The chaplains said patience was a virtue of the faithful. The sergeants said it was a weapon sharper than any blade. To a scout, it was both. It was survival. Our training turned inward now, away from close combat drills and ambushes. We were sent to the high crags above the ash wastes, where the wind screamed through broken spires of stone and the cold bit to the marrow. There we learned the sniper's art. The rifle was unlike the bolter, longer, heavier, quieter, a weapon of precision rather than brutality. A bolter roared, tearing flesh apart in gory violence. A sniper rifle whispered, killing with a single perfect breath. The sergeant made us lie prone on ridgelines for hours, our bodies pressed into the stone, the crosshairs fixed on a target we could not yet see. We learned to slow our hearts, to still every tremor in our muscles. We learned to breathe not as men, but as statues, letting the wind and world pass over us without notice. The first lesson was endurance. The second was vision. I stared through the scope until my eyes burned, until the rocks blurred and the horizon bled into shadow. At first, I saw nothing but stone and dust, then movement. The faintest shift of shadow, a carrion bird alighting on a corpse half buried in the sand, a scavenger rat darting from its hole, a ripple of ash disturbed by something larger moving beneath it. The world was not still, it only seemed so to those who lacked patience. "Do not wait for the enemy to show himself," the sergeant told us. "Know that he is already there. Anticipate, predict, punish." It was not enough to fire when the target appeared. We had to understand when and where he would appear. The sniper's art was not marksmanship, it was foresight. When the Orks returned in scattered mobs, we were ready. Our squad lay hidden in the high crags, cloaked in camo, rifles trained on the valley below. The Orks marched noisily, shouting, firing crude weapons into the air, their laughter echoing through the stone. They thought themselves predators. We became their executioners. One by one they fell. The first Orc skull erupted in a mist of bone and ichor. Before his corpse struck the ground, another dropped, then another. The mob grew restless, confused. They had not even seen us. Still, we waited. We did not fire into the thick of them. We chose leaders, heavy gunners, any who might rally the rest. Each shot was precise, each kill deliberate. The mob lost cohesion. Fear, a rare thing in Orks, crept into them. When they finally charged the ridgeline in rage, our traps sprung. Mines detonated, tearing them apart in showers of fire. Then the rest of the squad rose, bolters roaring, blades ready. By the time they reached us, they were already broken. I learned then that patience was more than waiting. It was control. It was forcing the enemy to play by your rhythm, to fight on your terms, to die at your choosing. And yet, patience had a darker lesson too. Sometimes, lying there in the cold, staring down the scope, I would see a face, not an orc, not a beast, but something more human. A deserter dragged into the wastes, a prisoner used as bait.
Once, a boy not much younger than I had been before the trials, chained to a stake, screaming for release as orcs gathered near. The sergeant gave the order, eliminate the Xenos, ignore the rest. So I did. My shot took the orc slaver through the skull. The boy's scream rose in relief, then turned to horror as the orcs tore him apart in frenzy. That was patience too. To endure, to obey, to let the innocent die because your scope was not meant for them. Patience was not only a weapon, it was a burden. Lying there in the cold stone silence, with the echo of gunfire still ringing in my ears, I realized that the sniper's art was not only foresight, it was the ability to endure the things you chose not to stop. And that, perhaps, was the hardest lesson of all.
The sergeant's voice was clipped and sharp through the vox bead. Eyes sharp. Something stalks you in the dark. Do not blink. Do not falter. I had thought him speaking in metaphor, another sermon wrapped in steel. But in the wastes, nothing was ever metaphor. We had been deployed for what was called a shadow exercise. At first it seemed like a simple reconnaissance sweep, our squad moving through ruins long since choked with ash and dust. Statues of forgotten saints jutted like broken teeth from the ground. Half-collapsed cathedrals loomed with shattered spires that clawed the sky. The wind carried voices that did not belong to the living. Yet something else was there with us. At first it was subtle, a trail half seen in the dust, the faint impression of talons dragging across Ferrocrete. Then came the silences. Moments when even the carrion birds ceased their circling, when the air itself felt held by invisible hands. We were scouts, trained to be unseen, but here it felt as though the darkness was hunting us. Brother Marcus was the first to vanish. One moment, he was covering the rear, muttering the catechism of vigilance. The next, the vox crackled with static. His position fell silent. We doubled back, weapons raised. All we found was his blood, painted in arcs across the wall, steaming in the cold air. Eyes sharp, the sergeant hissed again. This is no drill. The veterans called them lictors, Tyranid assassins, bioengineered predators, cloaked in chameleon skin, silent as the grave. They did not kill for sport, they killed for purpose. To sow terror, to dismantle cohesion, to bleed a unit dry before the swarm descended. We were not facing drills anymore. We were prey. Every rustle, every echo, every shifting shadow tightened the noose around our hearts. The auspex gave us nothing. The creature's camouflage bent light, heat, even sound. But its presence was undeniable, pressing on our minds like a claw at the back of the skull. Brother Darius fired first, a bolt round cracking into the dark. Stone burst apart in showers of grit, but nothing screamed, nothing fell. Then the lictor struck. It dropped from above, a blur of talons and hunger, and Darius was simply gone, impaled through the chest, lifted like a child's toy before the monster vanished again. His scream lingered longer than his body. Panic clawed at us, but the sergeant's orders cut through. Form a line, cover each other, make it bleed. So we did. We became statues, rifles tracking every shadow. Every breath was a hammer in my chest. The darkness shifted, feinting, probing. The lictor wanted us to break formation. It wanted fear to shatter discipline. But we were scouts of the Adeptus Astartes. I saw it then. Only a flicker, a distortion in the air where it had not been before. I squeezed the trigger, the rifle whispering fire. The shot struck true, tearing a spray of ichor that hissed as it struck the ground. The beast shrieked, a sound like steel ripping flesh. The squad opened fire, bolters and rifles spitting vengeance.
The lictor reeled, but it did not fall. Instead it lunged, talons carved through stone as easily as flesh. The sergeant met it head-on, his combat blade flashing, sparks flying as ceramic scraped against chitin. "Fall back," he barked. "Remember your training." We obeyed, but not without cost. Brother Hellion was too slow. One swipe tore him in half, leaving his body steaming in the cold. His blood fell on me, hot, metallic, searing into my memory. In that moment, I understood what the sergeant had meant. This was no exercise. This was our baptism. If we survived the lictor, we would no longer be scouts. We would be predators. I forced myself still, rifle steady. My breathing slowed, the world narrowing to the rhythm of the creature's movements. The sergeant drove it back with blade and faith, creating the opening I needed. The scope aligned. The reticle found the pulsing nodes along its skull. I exhaled. The shot cracked, the lictor's head bursting apart in gore. It twitched once, twice, then collapsed into the dust with a final hiss of steaming ichor. Silence returned, but it was not relief. It was the silence of graves. 3 brothers lay dead. The rest of us lived, but something had changed. The shadows had tested us, and only those strong enough to embrace fear had endured. The sergeant wiped blood from his blade. His gaze burned through me. "You have killed a monster, aspirant. Now you must prove you are not one yourself." I understood then. In the grim dark of the galaxy, training was not about learning how to fight. It was about learning how to survive the things that lurked in the dark. And the dark was endless.
The days after the lictor hunt blurred into a haze of exhaustion and silent grief. 3 of my brothers were gone, their names already recorded in the chaplain's books as martyrs in training. To the Imperium, their deaths were expected. To me, they were lessons carved in blood. There was no time for mourning. Our next trial came swiftly, as if the sergeants wished to hammer us while the wounds were still raw. We were sent into the ruins of a manufactorum, once a proud forge of the Emperor, now nothing but rusting skeletons of machinery and ash-choked halls. The sergeant's command was simple: hold until relieved. No time limit, no reinforcement, no further explanation. It should have been routine, but routine was a word that did not exist in the Grimdark galaxy. The enemy struck without warning. Not orcs this time, not a lictor, but a splinter swarm of Tyranid gaunts, chitinous nightmares, scuttling in endless waves, their talons clattering like rain on iron. We were scouts, few in number, light in armor, limited in firepower. They were many, too many. The manufactorum became our proving ground. We turned broken conveyor lines into barricades, shattered assembly frames into choke points. Mines were placed in hidden channels, frag grenades rigged to trip wires. Every bolt round was counted and blessed. Then the swarm came. It was a wall of flesh and chitin, shrieking with hunger, a tide that smashed against us with the fury of a storm. The first wave fell to sniper fire, skulls exploding in geysers of ichor. The second crashed into our minds, detonations ripping bodies apart in a frenzy of shrieks. Still they came. We fought as we had been trained, disciplined, precise, unyielding. I watched Brother Caius reload with machine-like calm, each bolt round chambered with ritual precision. Brother Lauren covered my flank, his combat blade flashing whenever a gaunt broke through the line. The sergeant was everywhere at once, his orders cutting through the chaos like lightning, his blade drenched in alien blood. And I was no longer the boy who trembled at shadows. Through the scope, I saw not just targets, but patterns. I anticipated the Gaunt's movements, predicting where they would leap, where they would swarm. Every shot I fired was not reaction, it was inevitability. One by one I reaped them, until their corpses clogged the choke points and their ichor pooled in rivers. But inevitability cuts both ways. The third wave broke through. A Hormagunt slammed into me, its talons slashing. I rolled, felt the blade scrape against the edge of my carapace armor. My combat knife found its throat, ripping upward, hot alien blood washing over me. The fight became a blur. Blood, claws, the roar of bolters, the screams of dying beasts. And amid it all, the certainty that we were being measured. This was not merely survival. This was judgment. Hours passed. Or perhaps it was only minutes. In the chaos, time meant nothing. The swarm pressed harder, faster, as if sensing our thin line of endurance. Then, at last, the Vox crackled. Relief inbound. Hold your ground. Relief. A promise. A cruel word. Because by then, there was nothing left to hold. Our barricades were gone, our ammunition nearly spent, our blades dulled with gore. We were bloodied, broken, yet still standing. When the relief force arrived, full-blooded space marines, armored in ceramite, bolters roaring like thunder, they found us not as aspirants, but as warriors. We were knee-deep in corpses, covered in alien ichor and our own blood. We had not broken. We had not fled. We had endured. The sergeant's voice carried over the din. You have proven your worth in blood. The Emperor accepts only survivors, and you have survived. I remember collapsing then, rifle slipping from my grasp, vision narrowing. The last thing I saw was the relief force advancing, their presence like living statues of war. For the first time, I believed I might truly become one of them. But deep inside, I knew the truth. Survival had a cost. The boy who had once walked into the trials was long dead. What remained was something colder, sharper, forged by fire and shadow. The Emperor had gained another weapon, and I had lost everything else.
The chaplains said patience was a virtue of the faithful. The sergeants said it was a weapon sharper than any blade. To a scout, it was both. It was survival. Our training turned inward now, away from close combat drills and ambushes. We were sent to the high crags above the ash wastes, where the wind screamed through broken spires of stone and the cold bit to the marrow. There we learned the sniper's art. The rifle was unlike the bolter, longer, heavier, quieter,
a weapon of precision rather than brutality. A bolter roared, tearing flesh apart in gory violence. A sniper rifle whispered, killing with a single perfect breath. The sergeant made us lie prone on ridgelines for hours, our bodies pressed into the stone, the crosshairs fixed on a target we could not yet see. We learned to slow our hearts, to still every tremor in our muscles. We learned to breathe not as men, but as statues, letting the wind and world pass over us without notice. The first lesson was endurance. The second was vision. I stared through the scope until my eyes burned, until the rocks blurred and the horizon bled into shadow. At first, I saw nothing but stone and dust, then movement. The faintest shift of shadow. A carrion bird alighting on a corpse half buried in the sand. A scavenger rat darting from its hole. A ripple of ash disturbed by something larger moving beneath it. The world was not still. It only seemed so to those who lacked patience. "Do not wait for the enemy to show himself," the sergeant told us. "Know that he is already there. Anticipate, predict, punish." It was not enough to fire when the target appeared. We had to understand when and where he would appear. The sniper's art was not marksmanship, it was foresight. When the orcs returned in scattered mobs, we were ready. Our squad lay hidden in the high crags, cloaked in camo, rifles trained on the valley below. The orcs marched noisily, shouting, firing crude weapons into the air, their laughter echoing through the stone. They thought themselves predators. We became their executioners. One by one they fell. The first orc skull erupted in a mist of bone and ichor. Before his corpse struck the ground, another dropped, then another. The mob grew restless, confused. They had not even seen us. Still, we waited. We did not fire into the thick of them. We chose leaders, heavy gunners, any who might rally the rest. Each shot was precise, each kill deliberate. The mob lost cohesion. Fear, a rare thing in orcs, crept into them. When they finally charged the ridgeline in rage, our traps sprung. Mines detonated, tearing them apart in showers of fire. Then the rest of the squad rose, bolters roaring, blades ready. By the time they reached us, they were already broken. I learned then that patience was more than waiting. It was control. It was forcing the enemy to play by your rhythm, to fight on your terms, to die at your choosing. And yet, patience had a darker lesson too. Sometimes, lying there in the cold, staring down the scope, I would see a face, not an orc, not a beast, but something more human. A deserter dragged into the wastes, a prisoner used as bait. Once, a boy not much younger than I had been before the trials, chained to a stake, screaming for release as orcs gathered near. The sergeant gave the order, "Eliminate the Xenos, ignore the rest." So I did. My shot took the orc slaver through the skull. The boy's scream rose in relief, then turned to horror as the orcs tore him apart in frenzy. That was patience too. To endure, to obey, to let the innocent die because your scope was not meant for them. Patience was not only a weapon, it was a burden.
Lying there in the cold stone silence, with the echo of gunfire still ringing in my ears, I realized that the sniper's art was not only foresight, it was the ability to endure the things you chose not to stop. And that, perhaps, was the hardest lesson of all.
In the end, the trials of a Space Marine scout were never meant to forge heroes. They were meant to strip away the last remnants of humanity until only duty remained. I had entered the fortress monastery as a boy, terrified and trembling. I left the vigil of ascension as something else, no longer a child, no longer even a man. I had become a weapon. But weapons are not born clean. They are tempered in blood, in loss, in the silence left by brothers who did not endure. I carry their faces still. Morris, dragged into shadow by the lictor. Hellion, torn apart in an instant. Caius, whose final prayer echoed even as the swarm devoured him. Their deaths were not accidents. They were the cost of my survival. That is the truth of training as a Space Marine scout. It is not a path of glory, it is a crucible of attrition. To survive is to inherit the burden of the fallen. To ascend is to know that you are standing on a mountain of corpses, your own included, for the boy you once were has already died. And yet, for all the horror, there is meaning. Every implant, every scar, every lesson carved in flesh was given so that I might stand between mankind and the endless night. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And in that war, there must be warriors who do not falter, who do not fear, who do not break. That is what it means to train as a Space Marine scout, to endure the impossible, to embrace the darkness, to rise, not as yourself, but as one of the Emperor's chosen. And so I march forward, reborn, weapon and servant both. The boy is gone. Only the scout remains.